Mountains are not what you think they are. Some of them are not formed, they are what's left. The remains of structures so large, calling them trees sounds absurd. And yet, less than 150 years ago, we were still cutting them down. There is a photograph from the 1880s. Men standing beside a tree so wide it looks like a wall. The stump behind them rises higher than two men combined. This wasn't rare. This was normal. That photograph has been seen by millions of people. Almost no one asks the obvious question. If trees this size existed 150 years ago, and they were cut down at industrial scale across an entire continent, but almost no one asks the only question that matters. If these were the small ones, what did the largest look like? The official answer is straightforward. North America was covered in old-growth forest before European settlement. The trees were large because they had grown undisturbed for centuries. The logging industry cleared most of it between roughly 1850 and 1920. What remains today, the managed forests, the national parks, the second-growth timber stands, these are what survived or regrew. The story is well documented. The environmental damage is acknowledged. The history is considered settled. But there is a problem with the settled history. Not a small problem, a geometric one. The trees in those photographs, the ones considered enormous, the ones that made loggers famous for their size, those trees were between 200 and 300 feet tall. The coastal redwoods that still exist today reach a maximum of about 380 feet. That is the upper limit of what we currently accept as possible for a living tree. And yet, when you look at certain landscapes, certain flat-topped elevated formations, certain isolated rock columns rising from plains, certain mesa structures in the American Southwest and beyond, the geometry does not match gradual geological erosion. It matches something else entirely. It matches the base of something that was once taller, much taller. The proposition is this: what we call mountains, in certain cases, are not mountains in the geological sense we have been taught. They are the biological remnants of a former world. They are stumps. The trees they came from were not 300 feet tall. They were not even 3,000 feet tall. The scale suggested by the structures themselves, if you treat them as organic bases rather than eroded stone, points to something closer to 40 miles in height. Structures so large that the word tree no longer feels adequate, but the geometry holds. And the record, once you look at it without the assumption of geology, is still there. Begin with the structure of a mesa. We're told mesas formed slowly, over millions of years, layer by layer, erosion shaping everything you see. But that explanation depends on one assumption: that the flat top was always horizontal. This is the standard explanation, and it is taught in every geology course on Earth. It is not unreasonable, but it has a condition built into it that is rarely examined. It assumes the caprock was horizontal to begin with. It assumes the flat top is a remnant of a once continuous flat layer. What it does not account for is a flat top that is flat because it was always a cross-section, the cut end of something vertical. The top of a stump is flat not because erosion preserved it. It is flat because that is what the inside of a severed trunk looks like. Look at the silica content of many mesa formations. Look at the internal ring-like layering visible in cross-section at certain exposed sites. Look at the hexagonal and radial fracture patterns in basalt columns. Formations like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, or the columns found throughout the American Northwest. The official explanation for hexagonal basalt columns is cooling lava. Molten rock contracts as it cools, and under certain conditions it cracks into polygonal columns. This is a real phenomenon, and it does occur. But the same hexagonal geometry appears in wood. It appears in the cellular structure of large woody tissue under compression. The pattern is not unique to cooling lava. It is also the pattern of a petrified interior. The mainstream explanation is not wrong. It may simply be incomplete, applied to structures it was never designed to explain. Now think about structure. Anything that stands at extreme height needs balance, weight distribution, stability, and strangely, some of these formations show exactly that, not random collapse, but controlled form. The scale argument widens when you leave North America. The same flat-topped elevated formations appear on every continent: the tepuis of Venezuela, the Table Mountains of South Africa, the elevated plateaus of Central Australia, the buttes of Central Asia. Every major geological tradition has its own word for them, and its own erosion-based explanation. What the official record does not do is compare them to each other as a global pattern, and ask whether the pattern itself requires a different explanation. When the same structure appears at the same scale on every landmass on Earth, the local geological explanation begins to feel like a category error. The pattern does not disappear simply because the official explanation changes by region. Every major human civilization left behind a memory of a world tree. The Norse called it Yggdrasil. The Hindu tradition described the Ashvatha, a cosmic tree whose roots were above and whose branches were below. The Mayan Siba connected the underworld, the earth, and the sky. The Babylonian records speak of a tree at the center of the world whose top touched heaven. These are treated as mythology, as metaphor, as the natural human impulse to find meaning through natural imagery. But there is another way to read a memory that appears independently in every human culture, on every continent. You can read it as a description. Something enormous was here. Every ancestor of every living human being saw it. They remembered it the only way they knew how. The mythological record and the geological record are pointing at the same thing from opposite directions. Now consider the timing of the industrial logging era and what it obscures. The most aggressive period of North American deforestation ran from approximately 1850 to 1920. It was so thorough and so fast that by the time photographic records became widespread, the largest trees were already gone. What remained were the second growth forests, already decades into their regrowth cycle, and the stumps. The stumps were massive. They were documented. Some of them were so large they were used as dance floors, as shelters, as landmarks. And then, systematically, they were removed. Not hidden, exactly. Not by a coordinated conspiracy. Simply cleared, because stumps were obstacles, because the land had economic value, because nobody was writing a preservation order for a stump. What changed was not the landscape. What changed was the explanation. The stumps became geology. The remnants became mountains. The record was not erased. It was reclassified. The mechanism for this reclassification did not require malice. It required only time and institutional habit. Geology as a formal scientific discipline was being codified at exactly the same moment that the last of the great forests were being cleared. The men writing the textbooks were working from a landscape that was already stripped. They looked at what remained, and they built a theory of origin around it, a theory that worked within the limits of what they could see. What they could not see was what had been removed. What they could not imagine was the original scale. Their explanation was not a lie. It was an inference drawn from incomplete evidence. The question is whether anyone since then, with better tools, better measurements, better comparative data, has ever seriously gone back and asked whether the inference was correct. The stone remembers. The layering is still there. The taper is still there. The flat top is still there. The hexagonal geometry is still there. What is not there is the rest of the structure. And the absence of a 300-foot trunk above a base the size of a mountain is treated as evidence that the base was always alone, always geological, always explainable by the slow patience of erosion. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the geology is exactly what it appears to be, and the resemblance to a biological base is coincidence, and the global pattern is parallel geology, and the mythological memory is metaphor. And the 1880s photographs show the largest trees that ever lived, and the story is settled. But the real question is not whether this interpretation sounds strange. Interpretations that overturn settled categories always sound strange at first. The real question is whether anyone with access to core samples, with ground-penetrating radar, with comparative biological and geological data, with the full archive of pre-industrial surveying records, has ever seriously looked. Not to confirm the official explanation, not to promote the alternative. The question is not whether you believe this. Belief is not what is being asked of you. What is being asked is simpler and more uncomfortable than belief. Look at the photograph again. The men, the axe, the stump that is taller than two men standing on each other's shoulders. Now look at a mesa. Look at a butte. Look at a basalt column rising clean from a valley floor. Ask yourself, not what you were told it is, but what it looks like. You already know what it looks like. The world was different once, not metaphorically, not in the way that all worlds change slowly over deep time. Different in a way that your ancestors saw with their own eyes and spent the rest of human history trying to describe to you. Every language found a different word for it. Every culture built it into the center of their cosmology. They were not being poetic. They were being precise. The cutting happened. The stumps remained. We named them mountains and moved on.